Hello, everyone. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Art's first annual virtual archaeology talk, Who Digs What? My name is Maria Lopez, and I'm the manager of film and lecture programs. Now, before we begin with the lecture, I'd like to give everyone an overview of the agenda for today. This virtual talk will last about 1 hour, where two lecturers will take turns presenting, and then we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. Please enter any questions for our speakers using the Q&A function or the chat box and specify who the question is for or if it's for both of them. We would also like to let you know that this lecture will be recorded and made available on the NCMA YouTube page, and we will also be sharing the link to the recording with you via email. We hope you enjoy the lecture. If you have any issues during the event, please let me know in the chat. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce the NCMA's Director of Research and Curator of Ancient Art and our very own archaeologist, Caroline Rocheleau. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you, Maria, for the introduction, but also thank you for your support. I've been trying to do this archaeology series for a little while, and it never sort of panned out. And when I proposed the idea to you, you were so excited about it. It's like, yes, finally, we can actually do this. So this is a new series that the NCMA is presenting, and it focuses on the archaeology collections at the museum. And so I'm trying to move my slide. Whoops. Because we want to feature all our archaeology collections with this series, not just the ones that you're more familiar with, for example, ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome, but also the wonderful cultures from the ancient Americas, like the Maya and the Inca and the Chimu, and many other cultures that we actually do have represented in our collections at the museum. Also, we want to celebrate October as Archaeology Month, so that's why the lecture will take place hopefully annually in October. And you might notice on our little title there that we call it a virtual archaeology talk. We don't want it to be a lecture. We want something a little bit more casual. And it will also always be virtual, even when the pandemic is over, because having a virtual lecture actually enables us to bring people from all over the world, archaeologists from all over the world, to talk about different topics related to our archaeological collections, whether it be something general or a very specific theme about one of those cultures, or even maybe a contrast between different cultures that share similarities. And we may even have like panel discussion, so even more than two people chatting together. So that's why we chose this particular format. And the reason I picked today's talk, Who Digs What, is because throughout my career, I've had a fair number of times people ask me whether I dug up dinosaurs. And well, I don't dig up dinosaurs. Archaeologists do not dig up dinosaurs at all. And I thought, since we're starting this new series, that perhaps this could be the starting point, explaining what archaeology is and isn't. And that would start us off for hopefully a long-lasting series. So if archaeologists do not dig up dinosaurs, what do we dig up? Sorry, my keyboard is suddenly not working anymore, so I have to scroll with the mouse. So archaeologists deal with a material culture. So first of all, archaeology is part of a field called anthropology, which is the study of humanity, of all humans, of all cultures, of all countries in the world. It doesn't matter, we're all humans, doesn't matter where we come from and what our cultures are. That's what anthropology is. Archaeology is a subfield, and we study something very specific that help us study humans around the world. And we study the things that humans make and use. So objects, things, artifacts. And that's what archaeologists call material culture. And that's what you see here on the screen. It could be something as small as a tiny little bead in a necklace, or it could be a large box that contains a mummy, a coffin, for example, or a wonderful piece of textile. It doesn't matter what the material is. It could be wood, it could be metal, it could be even a man-made material like faience, for example. But also material culture is not just small things, it's big things that humans make, like pyramids and temples, Stonehenge, a moai from Rapa Nui, for example. This is all part of what archaeologists study. So I thought for today's event, we could have something more than just me talking about archaeology, that it might be fun to have a paleontologist join us for this first chat. And I'd like to welcome Lindsay Zanno from the Natural Science Museum, who is a paleontologist, so that the two of us can compare and contrast our two fields together. So welcome, Lindsay.
Hi, Caroline. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I've just described what archaeologists look for, what archaeologists study. Perhaps we can start with what paleontologists actually study.
Yeah, absolutely. So paleontologists are not interested in material culture, although we may personally be interested in it. I, for one, really am fascinated by archaeology, but professionally, that's not where our interests are. What paleontologists study is the evolution of life throughout the history of the Earth. So that's about 4 billion years. And if you want to advance the slide, I have some paleo art showing what that transformation has looked like throughout time. We look at the record of life on Earth, which is about 4 billion years of life struggling to survive on a changing planet in the face of climate change and shifting continents and even things like mass extinctions. And there are a whole variety of different types of paleontologists. There are micropaleontology, people who study tiny microorganisms in the ocean. There are paleontologists called paleobotanists who study plants, or even palynologists who study fossil pollen. There are paleontologists who focus on invertebrate paleontology. So they study things like ancient insects and ancient mollusks and clams. And then there are vertebrate paleontologists. So those are people who study animals with a backbone, like fish and lizards and mammals and birds. And of course, dinosaurs. So I happen to be a dinosaur paleontologist, but I think it's really important to point out that most paleontologists also don't study dinosaurs, and that dinosaurs are just a small part of what paleontologists do. So I think one of the questions that you and I always get is probably the same question, which is like, what is it like to be in the field as a paleontologist or an archaeologist, and what is your typical day like out there? We actually do a lot of field work in my program. We spend several months a year on site doing field work in usually remote areas, desert areas. And because we're working in such remote areas for so long, we have to sort of bring everything we need with us for several months of the expedition, from the museum to the place where we're going to do the work. And once we get there, we'll usually set up a remote base camp. So this is an area where we set up some communal tents for housing equipment and for cooking and storing food and water and things like this. And then we'll set up our personal tents. We usually sleep in little dome tents and sleeping bags, and everybody sort of spread out over the landscape. Our typical day involves just getting up in the morning and having coffee and cooking breakfast. We don't have any facilities at these remote camps. We don't have any running water or electricity or any sewers or anything like that. So we have to cook our own food and bring all of our own water. So sometimes we have several 100-gallon water tanks with us that we have to fill up every few days just to keep the team hydrated. So we'll cook breakfast, we'll load up our gear, and we'll usually hike to a quarry on the top of a hill somewhere and work all day, and then hike back to camp and have a good evening in camp. One of the things that's probably similar between your work and my work is that when you're out there in these conditions, you know, you have to deal with a lot of extreme weather. I know that this summer when we were out in the American West, we had to deal with forest fires, with flash flooding, with extreme heat over 120 degrees, and even sandstorms, which is really unusual for us. But I have a feeling, Caroline, that maybe you guys have to deal with sandstorms as a regular feature of your work.
Yes, we do. We do. So I can show a slide of what it's like in my area. And like Lindsay said, sometimes we're out there almost in the desert. But I think one of the major differences with archaeology is that sometimes, for example, if you live in Raleigh and you dig in Raleigh in an area nearby, you go home afterwards. So you could be that lucky. Or you might have to take your vehicle and drive for 2 or 3 hours before you even get to the archaeological site that you're excavating. In my case, I've been rather fortunate that all the digs I've been on, whether in the Sudan or in Jordan, the dig site was spitting distance from either the house that we rented or the house that we built. Archaeologists often build what we call a dig house, which is near the archaeological site. But even though it is a dig house, as you can see, it is still very sort of more like glamping than camping, because we do have some amenities. It doesn't look like it, but we do. This dig that you see here illustrated fairly early on in the dig, we asked for a grant from the Canadian government. It's a British, Sudanese, and mostly Canadian dig. To get funds to have the whole entire town have pipes for water, because there's an artesian well and you have to go get your water from there with buckets. And we managed to get funds to get the water to everybody in the village. So you get there's no tap. At some point in the morning, your pipe starts gushing and you fill in all your buckets, and that will last you for the day. So a little bit more fortunate, I guess, in that way. But otherwise, on our dig, you do it mostly sort of a la Sudanese, where we're eating together, all from the same tray with the same food. And it is very important to note that this is your fork and this is your toilet paper. This is your fork. This is your toilet paper. You never use your left hand when you're eating from a communal tray. Once you have it in your hands, you can do whatever. But when you're reaching out, that is the one thing they teach us. The first thing is never eat with your left hand. Most people will sleep outside, even though we have tents. It's like you were saying, that's for our gear, that's for our stuff. And we've been building little rooms every year. So now we have actual like rooms, but nobody sleeps in the tents or the rooms because it's too hot. I have this weird allergy. I'm allergic to drafts and the wind. So I sleep in a bishareen home, which is the sort of igloo, if you will, made with mats. So it blocks most of the wind, but it's much, much cooler than any of the tents that you would have. And yes, we do have to contend with sandstorms, which mean you can't do anything for how many hours they last. And the one that I was in, it happened at night. So we all kind of huddled under our sleeping bags, and it was natural exfoliation for the next 5 hours. And you woke up the next morning with about an inch of sand in your bed. So that's sort of the life of an archaeologist. If you like camping, if you like the great outdoors, I think for both our career choices, that's a very reasonable trait that you want. It's like, if you don't like being outside, I don't think this is the right choice for you. Now, one of the questions I always get, and I think you get that as well, is how do you know where to dig? And I have to say, the first thing though, before you even go anywhere, is you have to request your permits. You have to obtain an excavation permits for the antiquities department in the country that you want to excavate. And you'll also need security clearance from that same country. But if you're applying for an excavation permit, you already know where you want to dig, because you have to submit a research proposal and tell them what your research question is. Why do you want to go at this site, and what feature of this site could help you answer your research question. So you already know where to dig, and I'll go into that a little bit later. But do you need permits as well for paleontology?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the most unromantic part of our jobs, right, Caroline? Where we always talk about the romantic part, but the truth is that at least I spend months every year, usually over the long, cold winters, dealing with permitting and reports associated with what we're doing. So for us, it's there's partly what country you're going to, but also there's a lot related to who owns the surface at the land surface. Is this federal land? Is it state land? Is it private land? And the process that you go through to get permission to work is related to who owns the land at the surface, because that's technically who owns the fossils that we're digging up, even though they're somewhat below the surface. And so we have permits that we have to submit with the federal government. And then, like you, will reach out to local landowners and local communities. We work a lot near, say, tribal lands. And so we'll connect with our local people living in the area to talk to them about where we're going to be and get permission to cross people's property, because it usually is several miles from, say, where we're going to camp to where we have to end up working. So very similar. I think the one interesting thing I would point out that most people probably don't know is that when it comes to permitting, archaeo sort of trumps paleo, because one of the things that we have to do to get a permit to dig up dinosaurs is we have to have an archaeologist go to our proposed location and clear it for archaeology to make sure that we're not disturbing any archaeological sites, which I bet you guys probably usually don't have to do, Caroline, in your permitting.
Yeah, because your stuff would be located underneath our stuff.
Right. So, and if we do find archaeological artifacts, it can completely disrupt, they can literally turn us down. So, we are actually maybe encouraging a lot of archaeological exploration in areas that otherwise wouldn't be looked at, just because it's part of the permitting process for everything we want to dig up. So you were talking about how you have to, before you apply for a permit, you kind of already have to have done your research. And so a lot of what happens for us is that several months before we want to go out, we spend a lot of time doing satellite research. So it's really nice nowadays, and it didn't used to be this way, when I was a grad student many years ago, but the satellite access that we have now is great. And what you can actually do is overlay maps onto these satellites and get sort of a view of both the topography and the satellite imagery, but also ancillary information. Like on the right of this photo, it shows you land ownership. So the different colors represent who owns the land. And so you can pinpoint exactly where you want to go and know who you have to apply to a permit for. On the left side of the slide, you'll see colors that represent the age of the rocks and the geologic formation. So one of the pieces of information that's super valuable to us is to be able to overlay these geological maps onto the landscape, because what geologists have done is they've actually mapped the age of the rock at the surface of the earth. And so if I want to go find a Stegosaurus, I know I need to find rocks that are late Jurassic in age, and I need to look at these maps to see exactly where rocks of that right age are exposed at the surface. Now, once we get to the site that we want to explore, it's really just the same thing paleontologists have done for centuries, which is we get a GPS and we get on site and we start walking around. We'll hike 8 or 10 miles a day through Badlands, just actually physically looking at the ground for places where fossils are sticking out of the hillside. And so we'll see these fossils sort of eroding out and breaking up into pieces down a hill, and we'll trace them up the hill and try and locate actually where the fossils are in the ground. And I've got a couple of images that show you how also kind of unromantic looking fossils are when they're sticking out of the ground. So for example, this is a piece of a whole Triceratops skull that's sticking out of the ground when it was first found. And on the other side with the Canon lens, that's a leg bone of a new species of Tyrannosaur. And it doesn't look like much, but once you start digging in, hopefully it turns into something really great. So Caroline, I know that you guys use satellite imagery, but you also do all kinds of different technologies as well.
Yes, and just like you mentioned, I mean, these fields have been around for a few hundred years. So we do have on the previous slide that where I talked about the permit, I mean, we'll look at books. So basically it's three things. You have your nose in the book, your boots on the ground, or your eye in the sky. And that's how you will find archaeological sites. So if you're using published material, those old explorer diaries and things like this, you'll get an approximate idea of where the site is, but usually it's because there's stuff sticking out of the ground that is pretty obvious that there's an archaeological site, that humans have made stuff here. So when you're on the surface, it could look like the photo on the left, which is an Egyptian temple in Sudan, and one column is still standing up. But most of the time, it looks more like the image on the right, where you get, suddenly you start walking and you'll have bricks and sherds all over the place, but these seem to be concentrated and then they peter out. So there's something there underneath the surface, and what you see is just broken bits of bricks and pottery. And actually a lot of the sites in Sudan have the name broken bricks in their native names, like Dangail means, I think means like pile of broken bricks. So if you talk to the locals, they will know, it's like, oh yes, there's a pile of broken bricks over there. So you know there's something going on. You will have to start digging to know exactly what that is. And that's because once you find a good spot, whether it's 5,000 years ago or today, people live in the same areas. You need to access to water. So the sites are still being used today, and they work around usually, but not always, the archaeological site. But sometimes the site is actually underneath their houses. And what if on the surface there's nothing much, or you want to know exactly where to dig on the surface, you could use GPR or magnetometry, which will basically tell you what's underneath, so that you know if there's a building, because the GPR will tell you, it's basically like a radar, tells you where the bricks are, the stones are, because they all have different densities, and you'll get an idea, and you can say, I'm going to dig there, because from what I see with the result of the survey, there's something there. So that's one possibility. Very often we do this a little bit afterwards as well, to see how far things extend as well. If you don't know where to dig, or you want to find somewhere new, then we'll use aerial photography and satellite imaging. And you see it here, where you see the bend of the Nile, and from above, you can see a much wider expanse of terrain, and you can see differences in the levels that you wouldn't necessarily see as you're walking the ground. So we'll use that as well. Here's satellite imagery that has become very popular in the last few years. And this is an image of Egyptologist Sarah Parkak. She's called the space archaeologist because she uses satellite imagery to help with her research. And then this does not apply so much to Egyptology or nubiology, because we don't have that sort of landscape. It's mostly desert in our case, but LiDAR, which basically means light detection and ranging. It's a remote sensing method that when you're flying your plane, and I think you could do it maybe with a drone as well, it measures the variable distances from where your machine is located and what's on the ground. And if you hit a building, it'll take not as long to come back to the sensor than if it hits the earth. But the cool thing about this is that you can eliminate all the trees. So if you're digging, for example, in Mexico or Guatemala, like the Maya empires, or if you're in Cambodia, where there's lots and lots of vegetation, where even from above, it's hard to see anything. This actually is super helpful because it removes all the trees, but it shows all the various distances are preserved, and you can tell that some are actual buildings when you get the result. So that's been very exciting for those parts of the world. That has improved their field season dramatically, but that does not apply specifically to Egyptology right now. So I've never actually used that. But once you're there on the ground and you've decided where you want to dig, we just set up a square, basically. Our unit here on the image, it's a very small one. We don't typically use just a 1 meter grid. You want a much bigger square. We tend to do like 4 meters, and you can see it on the right. And it's kind of exactly like that small one. There's our peg in the corner and our string, which is also pink. You want something that will not get dirty, because if it gets the color of the sand, then you can't see it, and you and your workers will trip over the lines. Very often we put empty bottles of like 7-Up because they're bright green on the corners of the pegs. Because right now you can see it's not that deep, but the pit, the square can be brought down all the way to bedrock if needed. So it sometimes could be quite a ways to fall if you trip over that one little string. And the tools that we use are pretty much what people expect. The trowel, of course, or the little brushes, but that's really when you actually find something. Otherwise, we use what other people in their fields use, like a farmer's hoe is easier to use than a shovel, for example. We'll work with surveyors, or we'll also learn how to use surveying tools as well. And the one thing that I think people don't really realize is that when you start digging that square, you remove just 10 centimeters across the whole thing. Then you go back to the other side, remove another 10 centimeters. And if Indiana Jones actually did this in the movies, it would be a very, very boring movie, because sometimes for days, there's nothing. You just move dirt and nothing is coming out of the ground. There was one season where the only thing we found that one season was a plumb bob, a Merowittic plumb bob, like a 2,000-year-old plumb bob. That's all we found. So it could be very unexciting at times. So when we find things, well, of course, very excited. We have to record everything before anything is taken out of the ground. So when we've worked with the surveyor, we have a map of the site, and we have points on the site that we can use afterwards to measure where things are on the dig and plot them on our map. So you have to record everything with photographs, but also with drawing. Like, people think that photographs show everything. They don't. So we have a lot of maps and plans and cross sections documenting things with drawings as well. And we have dig diaries where you note features. For example, at the bottom on the right, that it just looks like a column, but that column has been burnt. So you have to note that to see how it fits with others, because the slide just above it is actually a big chunk of roof beam from the temple that fell to the ground when actually the whole temple was burnt to the ground. So with that one big chunk of charcoal, you can also date the site, because you have carbon dating. So you have to record everything, things that might seem unimportant. You have to note everything and then go back afterwards and see how things fit together. And that's one of the things why it's very important to know that, because where the objects come from and how they relate to other things, that helps you interpret it later on and see how they were used. So do you do something similar? Your stuff is all in rocks, so I guess you're not using a teeny brush and a trowel.
Yeah, well, for starters, what you said really resonated me about sometimes you can sit there for, days and weeks and just do, basically doing nothing more than removing dirt. And I think that's an interesting point of comparison, because, you know, when I described how paleontologists find fossils and that most of the time we're just hiking around looking, I've been on expeditions where for 4 weeks we've hiked around and found virtually nothing, right? You're just hiking 10 miles a day, every day, and finding zip. And the same thing is true when we're excavating. You know, you can be hammering away at rock for days and days and days, and there just happens to be no bone where you're working. And so those are really similar situations that we encounter. I think probably the big difference, like you said, is that because we're working in really old ecosystems and the rock, the sediments where those ecosystems were buried are now rock, probably the biggest difference is just the challenge of getting through rock to actually get to our bones. Although I imagine, you know, when you guys have a site like Pompeii or something, you're kind of on the rare occasion dealing with removing hard rock. For us, it's kind of the place we start all the time. And that means we usually use pretty heavy equipment, you know, electric and gas powered jackhammers, a lot of saws, heavy picks and shovels. And sometimes we spend several weeks to several months just removing the huge amount of rock that's on top of the dinosaur bones we want to excavate. Once we get down to that layer, it sort of depends on how hard the rock is that surrounds the bones. It might still be really hard sandstone or other types of rock that are really difficult to break. And so I think that's a little bit different for us when we're excavating, is that the type and consistency of the rock often dictates how we approach it. Like, I wish we could just remove 10 centimeters at a time and record everything, because that sounds like really great data, but the rock just doesn't really work that way for us, right? And so we kind of let the fossils, the shape of the skeletons and the way the fossils are entombed in the rock kind of guide us into more of kind of a flexible ad hoc approach to actually doing the quarrying itself. Similar to what you do though, data collection for us is huge. The context of a fossil is what makes it scientifically significant. This is one of the problems that we have with commercial collecting or amateur collecting. If the individual collecting a fossil isn't trained in how to collect all the data on site, often that fossil can be scientifically useless if we don't have the geologic context from where it came. So we also actually use grid squares. Yay, there's an overlap to do mapping in the quarry, so we can create quarry maps. And that can be, you know, really primitively done with plumb bobs and grids, or it can be high tech, like you're saying, with surveying equipment. We also do a lot of surface scanning of the actual quarries on site now to create 3D models that capture every bone and its position in the quarry so that we have access to that later. And we record things like you were mentioning, the condition of the bones and the orientation of the bones and the depth and position of the bones in the actual quarry. One of the things that we have to deal with is protecting fossils for transport, because other than all that data collection on site, almost everything we discovered needs to come back to the museum. Very few things can actually remain in the field, and largely that's because the fossils that stay on the surface will just turn into dust eventually, right? The earth will just consume them through erosion. So for collecting fossils, what we want to do is actually expose as little of the fossil as possible, but be able to get around it and create kind of a casing of the fossil inside the rock where it was found. And then we will protect that with wet plaster and burlap bandages. This is the same way it's been done for a century. And reinforce that if necessary, and then flip it over, do the other side until the entire fossil is encased in this plaster casing. And that allows the fossil to be protected so that it can be brought back to the museum. Now, how we actually get these fossils out of the field is a challenge, because as I said, we're usually pretty far from civilization, and actually we're usually pretty far from like even a road where you could drive up. It's only been like 1 or 2 times in my life where I've been able to drive a vehicle right to the quarry and like load a fossil. So the options for us are, you know, if it's less than a couple 100 pounds, sometimes we can carry it in a backpack with one person. If it's over that, we strap it to one of these stretchers, and we use teams of people to haul it several miles out of the field to camp. And if it's really heavy, there's a picture on the right of a dinosaur nest that we had to collect that ended up being about 1,500 pounds. We'll use helicopters. We'll sort of flip the jacket into a helicopter net, and the helicopter will come pick it up and transport it back to a vehicle so that we can get it back to the museum. So I imagine there might be some differences there with how you guys deal with collecting specimens.
Yes, typically they're not as heavy as yours, although from the slides I'm showing here, the year before you, we had nothing but that plumb bob. We had statues popping out of the ground like nobody's business. It was actually quite remarkable. And what was actually super fun was none of us were really expecting this. Because there's only 2 other sites in Sudan where such statues have been found, and typically more neatly grouped in a pit, basically as a cache. These are actually kind of strewn in that one room in the temple. And the one on the left, it's a bit hard to see, like right here, that statue weighs 1 ton. It is enormous. It is of granite, and granite is not found in that region of Sudan. We're near the 5th cataract. You have to go to the 3rd, or actually you have to go to what is now Egypt for the granite quarries. So that was a bit unexpected, but you can't remove anything until when you excavated. That statue was actually sideways, so you can pop it out of the ground until you reach the bottom of it. And so you can see on the photos, we also kept the room intact for several nights where we had guards sleeping in the temple because some of the other ones are portable. They're small enough to fit in a plastic bag. So because we wanted an overview of that whole room where those statues were located, but because they're portable antiquities, once that was done, they had to be removed from the site. And it was quite a feat because we have low-tech equipment here. It was pieces of wood, burlap, some rope, and basically if you have a basic knowledge of physics and you have a few muscles, you can do this. So it's really all human power, brain power, and brawn, basically. So that 1 ton statue, which was the one that went all the way down in the pit, we basically, and we had some people from the village, like the mason, I think, was there, and helping us basically sort of raise a platform as you went, a little bit of lift the thing, put a brick underneath, and then just create a platform until it was equal to the ground, because that's actually, if I'm in the temple, you can't see me. I'm 5'2", and this is over 5 feet tall. So you had to bring that up. No helicopters, no nothing. And then we just put it, you can see the guys hauling that statue into the back of the pickup truck that went when it was loaded with the statue. Otherwise, things are small enough to be carried in a bag the 300 meters away from, our dig house. So that's fairly easy. That was the first time that we had to remove something as heavy. Otherwise, that's not a usual thing, at least in where I work. Yeah. And when we get to the house, so things are recorded on site, as we've mentioned, both of us have mentioned before, but some of the objects are easier drawn when you're actually back at the dig house. So one year I found a whole bunch of plaster fragments. Some were actually plaster, like gypsum plaster. Others were mud plaster. And those were recorded back at the house. The drawings that could get later on digitized if necessary, they get photographed as well. And those are really difficult to store, especially the mud plaster is just dried mud with a very, very thin layer of white on which the painting is applied. And those get packed up in boxes with lots of cotton in between. So yeah, that's some of the things we record at the house. So where we're working right now in Dangal, I work in the temple, but there's also a cemetery nearby that was discovered when they were trying to lay down some pipes And so then the work had to stop, and our team, sort of, since we were there, we have a representative of the Antiquities Department. There's always an inspector digging with you. And it basically, we started doing excavations there because they weren't sure, is this a Muslim cemetery or is this an ancient cemetery? And it turned out to be a 2,000-year-old Meroitic cemetery. So at the house, I draw everything, whether it came from the temple or not. I'm the site artist. I don't do the sherds. I leave that to other people. I just draw the full pots or the statues and stuff like this. So very often you will have someone on your team who is an illustrator as well. So that's sort of my job. My art degree that my mom thought would never be useful actually is really useful. So that's part of some of the work that we do after we're done for the day. We're not really done for the day. We continue working at the house, and that's where all the recording, we have running lists of what is happening in each unit, what object, and you label everything. So you have multiple lists going on all at the same time. And then what happens to those objects? Well, in archaeology, for the most part, things stay in those countries. Archaeologists can't take things back to their own museum or their own countries anymore. And more, the local populations want to have their own little museums. They don't necessarily want those big, nice statues to be sent to the National Museum in Khartoum. They're very, very proud of their heritage and what came out of the site that's near their village. So this is just an example. Those same statues, ours are like this, but these ones are the ones that came from higher north in Sudan. They created a museum for that archaeological site. So it's a question of funding at some point, and the locals and the elders in Dangale did come to us when they realized that we had found something significant. They said, we would like at some point to have a museum in our town. So we're hoping that things will get there eventually, but it's a question of funding. Even though we've discovered an archaeological site, we have to preserve it. You may think that because we're in the desert, nothing much happens. Sand erosion is quite drastic because it's windy all the time. And people don't realize that in Sudan, we actually have monsoon rains. So your nice temple can turn into a swimming pool really, really quickly. So we have to dig little channels for water to evacuate. We have to cover anything. So we work with conservators to help us do that. And we actually train a local team to do that when we're not there. If something happens during a rain, they can go and fix it afterwards. So we train some of the locals for preservation of those archaeological sites. And in Dangale, I haven't actually seen this. This has happened since I was last there. But for the longest time, we had these little rooms made out of brick around all these wonderful sandstone column. And sandstone, as you probably know, is very friable. These ones, you practically look at it and they crumble. They're so friable. So we had to protect them, even though we were digging still in the temple. And eventually we were able to put a roof and walls around it. So now people can actually visit and see it, and they're much better protected at the same time. So I guess a lot of that happens for your field as well. I mean, I've seen some of the slides already. So can you tell us about site preservation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit different for us in that most fossils that are found are either small and isolated. You know, you might find part of a single skeleton, and it's not really a place where you can set up conservation. Plus, in contrast to a lot of what you're describing, Caroline, a lot of what we have is in very remote areas where no one is going to be able to go out and see it. So for the most part, I think for paleontologists, it's a matter of collecting the specimen with as much of that sediment matrix context as you can take and bringing it back to the museum for preservation. That being said, there are a lot of great places where you have mass accumulations of fossils, you know, things like Dinosaur National Monument, where you have a huge wall of fossils, or the Cleveland Lloyd Quarry in Utah, And similar to what you're describing, they set up buildings around these places where you can see the fossils in the ground. And they're usually active research sites where researchers are still working, excavating and researching the localities, but it offers people a chance to see what the bones actually look like in the ground. One place where this always pretty much happens is with track sites. So because track sites are often huge and you can't really remove them, you can't, remove a 100-foot long section of dinosaur tracks and take it to the museum. Track sites are very popular places where you can actually have conservation of the fossil material in the ground. But as I said, for the most part, this is a quarry we had 2 years ago in New Mexico. We had to take 30 feet of rock off the top of this quarry. But for the most part, for us, we reclimate our sites. So instead of preserving things in the ground, we remove them and then we will fill this giant hole in. After we've just spent 3 months digging it out, we'll turn around and reshovel everything back into the hole. And hopefully in a year or two, you won't even be able to tell that we were actually there. People might find it interesting that not only do we do this at the end, we have to actually do it at the end of each season. So we'll dig for summer, we'll expose, what we expose, and then each summer we'll cover the remaining fossils with a tarp or something, and then we'll rebury the entire site. And then when we get there the following summer, our first job is to just unbury yet again the bones that we just reburied. And so that's our way of kind of protecting the fossil material over the winter until we can get back.
Yeah, we do that too, depending on where you're digging. If you want to preserve it for next season, half the time, especially if you have flooring, you need to put sand back in the hole to preserve the flooring of a temple or whatever building. So we do similar things as well. Yeah.
And then, of course, those plaster packages full of fossils that I showed earlier, the ultimate goal is to get them back to the museum and to the conservation lab or the preparation lab, where we have some staff who are experts in this area and a lot of volunteers who come in, and their job is to clean all that sediment away from the fossil and stabilize the fossil with basically resins that are embedded into the fossil. They're archival, so they're removable, but they hold the pieces of the fossil together so it doesn't crumble now that it's exposed to air and changes in temperature. And then create archival housings to store fossils so that they can be studied, right, for generations in perpetuity at the museum. One of the things that's happening more and more these days, it's really a revolution, I think, in museum science, is that we don't just bring things back now and put them on a shelf, we digitize them, which is a way of creating a more permanent record, digital record of the shape of that fossil. So this could be a surface scan that only records the shape of the surface, or it could be a CT scan, similar to if you get a broken leg, you'll go in and have an internal picture of your bone created. And then we can upload those online and create digital catalogs so that the public can actually look with and kind of view the collections that are inaccessible to them most of the time, but also so we can share those data with researchers all around the world, because you can send someone a digital copy of the specimen and they can 3D print a copy, somewhere without actually having to come to the museum. And then, God forbid, if something ever happens to the specimen, you also have a digital record as a kind of a backup. Ultimately, of course, Caroline, the reason we're doing all this field work is to get data so we can do science. And for paleontology, more and more these days, this involves some form of destructive sampling, actually, where you're either cutting a slice out of the bone or you're powderizing the bone to do isotope analyses, or you're doing molecular or chemical analyses, looking for ancient molecules or chemical fingerprints in the bone. And this is largely all focused on revolutionizing the study of the biology of these animals, because fossils may seem like just rocks in the shape of bone, but they actually preserve a whole lot of biological data from when those animals were alive. And this is something that we're learning more about every day as paleontologists. So what kind of research do you guys usually do with your stuff?
Yes, if I can get to that slide. Apparently not. We do research because and publications as well, because if you don't publish your research, it's pretty much useless. There we go. The computer is getting a little bit slow. So we'll publish site reports. Those tend to be shorter annual publications. And then with all the material, you can use what other archaeologists have dug up, and you might be a historian, for example, and you're studying the culture. So you're using the archaeological data to tell more, to get more information about the culture itself, because that's the whole point of archaeology. You can publish also smaller publications, and we're seeing this more and more for the local populations, for the schools, so that they know what we're working on and what we're finding, and they take an interest in their own cultural heritage. So more and more you see this happening, and it happens that sometimes when we're doing our research, we need to investigate things in a different way, and this is going to be the last slide and story I'm going to tell today. But part of this project, we had to do experimental archaeologists. So basically, we're trying to find out something, and we have to replicate what we think the ancient peoples were doing. So on our site, there was this big, huge mound that was next to the temple, and there were lots and lots, not bricks, but only potsherds, but of a very specific type of potsherds. And I was not there that season, thank goodness, because they dug up 1.7 million sherds. At first, they were counting them one by one, and they said, oh no, this is going to be way too long. They started counting approximately how many there were in a bucket. And it came to like one point, it was astounding, the amount of sherds, but they're all of the same type of vessel, this sort of conical shaped vessel, and these have always been called bread molds. And so we wanted to investigate what that was, because in Egypt, bread offerings, yes, happens all the time, not a problem. We weren't sure what was going on here, so we did phtholith analysis, which is basically looking inside the ceramics to see if there's any plant material. And this told us that this was not wheat. It wasn't bread that was being made in those ceramics, that it was actually something made out of sorghum. So our little experiment was trying to find in modern society, is there a recipe for something that is based out of sorghum that could be an offering in a temple? And there is something called acida, which is basically just sorghum and water. So we asked our neighbor, Altitoma made it for us, and we tried it not in one of the artifacts, but we had a glass jar, and it was impossible to get it out of there. So you have to break it to get that thing out of there. And the thing is not bread. It is sort of a stiff porridge. So you can see why those molds are all broken. You can't take the thing out of there without breaking it. And so, of course, that was our dinner afterwards. And for me, I do not like porridge of any kind. I tried it. I hated it. Mahmoud is laughing at me on the left, on the right there at the bottom. Did not like it. But it could also be a sorghum-based alcoholic beverage, because all we know is that sorghum was involved in this. So we're not sure what it is exactly, but we did experiments and tried to figure out, and you got an article out of this. And then people are thinking differently about those bread molds because, well, they're not bread. So now we're calling them offering molds. So yeah, so I'm sure you don't do those sorts of things with your dinosaurs unless you're in Jurassic Park, the movie. But that's basically it for the life of an archaeologist and a paleontologist. And I don't know, Maria, did we get any questions for either of us? And thank you for joining me, Lindsay. If anybody has questions, as Maria said earlier, put it in the chat or in the Q&A, and I can stop sharing my screen.
Okay, so we did get a couple of questions. Let's see, sorting through it right now. Okay, this is a question for both. What type of archaeological or paleo finds are common in Raleigh?
Well, as I specialize in ancient Egypt, I don't dig in Raleigh, but you might expect some colonial sites, Civil War sites, for example. Both the Natural Science Museum and the Art Museum are part of the NCR, which is the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. And there is an Office of State Archaeology that deals with the archaeology that's going on in the state of North Carolina. So I'm thinking of sites, for example, even like underwater archaeology out on the coast. Queen Anne's Revenge, for example, I think ECE was digging there. Well, digging underwater, of course. So those are the kinds of things that you would have in Raleigh and North Carolina. I think they were digging some cemeteries, some old cemeteries recently that I saw. Most of my friends don't work in Raleigh, they're strewn all over the world. But yes, we do have a lot of archaeologists in Raleigh. Any dinosaurs in?
No dinosaurs in Raleigh. So one of the problems is that during the time when most dinosaurs are around, at least Cretaceous dinosaurs, which is what I study, half of North Carolina was actually underwater. So that's not a good place for dinosaurs to live. What North Carolina does have in terms of, close to the dinosaur record is one of the best records in the world of the animals that lived sort of right around the time when dinosaurs first evolved. So these are animals from the Triassic. And there are actually a number of quarries nearby Raleigh, one near Durham and others that sort of cut across the Piedmont. And these are brick quarries. So most of the bricks that you see around North Carolina probably include the remains of ground up cool fossils, because when we go into the brick quarries, we're actually able to find really world-class skeletons of these Triassic animals, which are more sort of primitive mammals and other types of ancient reptiles before dinosaurs became really common.
All right, thank you. We also got a question from Caroline asking, this is for both, what was your most exciting find?
Do you want to start, Lindsay?
Maybe this is an unsatisfying answer, but my most exciting find is always my new find. So, I mean, it's literally like every year we go out in the field, and I was telling Caroline about this earlier, for paleontologists, you find a little bit of something sticking out of the hill and you're just not sure, is it some incredible discovery or is it nothing? And you really aren't allowed to figure that out before you go through this year-long process of getting a permit. So you sort of find something and you think it's probably incredible, and then you wait a year and then you go back and you remove all that overburden and really get to dig in. But I think it's that process of being the first to discover something and wondering how amazing it's going to be is sort of more exciting for me than actually once you sort of figure out the story. Maybe that's why we're scientists in the first place, is it's the hook of the discovery part that really gets us excited. Once we kind of have the answers, we're kind of on to the next discovery.
I have to say, for me, it was those statues that I mentioned. I actually found those, so that was very exciting, and it was kind of fluke because we found the feet of when we had gotten down almost to the floor, and then suddenly we saw this it's just from the ankle down with the platform on which the statue used to stand. And when we saw this, we realized, oh, in this room there might be something else. And since we had reached the floor, we decided to open up a square right next to it, fairly large, that went to the wall, the back wall of the museum. And that day, the dig director works at the British Museum, even though she's Canadian. And it so happened that her boss and her supervisor were visiting the site and was like, oh, look, we found the foot of this granite statue. And as I left the next morning, I told him, I'm going to find you that statue. Well, I came back to the house 2 hours later. It's like, I found that statue because we had removed that 10 centimeter layer, I think twice. And we saw another piece of granite sticking out of the ground. I'm like, okay, dig another, and it was like, okay, this is the body that goes with the statue, but from the knees up. So when I went to the house, nobody believed me. It was like, no, you're joking. You can't possibly have found the rest of that statue. I'm like, well, don't believe me. Sure, fine. But I got you that statue. And when they moseyed on over just before lunchtime, they're like, oh my God, you found the statue. I was like, well, I told you so 2 hours ago. So it was, and then the statues just kept popping out of the ground. It was quite remarkable. I've never done this before, and I probably won't ever do it again, because the following year we just found a plumb bob. So yeah, that's my most exciting find. Yeah.
Thank you for both for sharing. And now I have some specific questions. Ashley asked Caroline, she is curious to know what brought you to work in Sudan. And is that where you do a majority of your digging work? And a question related to this is, how has the Sudan Civil War affected your work?
I sort of ended up working in Sudan by fluke, because I was always interested in Egyptology. And when I was very little, I was actually interested in the temples that had been removed during that UNESCO campaign in the 60s, when they were building the second high dam at Aswan, and those temples had been dismantled and moved to higher grounds. Those are actually in Nubia, which is part of south of Egypt and the north of Sudan. So I was always interested in those. And it so happened, I was interested in archaeology, and but this was fairly late in my career. I was finishing up my master's degree, and I had taken archaeology classes, but I had never been on a dig. And one of my professors said, oh, do you want to come work with me in Sudan? I was like, well, I know nothing about archaeology other than what I've learned in books. But that 1 year, I got one of those like application to study grant, and they just gave me like $4,000, and it's like, you can do whatever you want with it. So I went on the field school in Jordan, and I loved it so much. I came back after it and went straight to my professor. He's like, yes, I want to go with you to Sudan. And that was it. And Sudan is now there's, yes, the Civil War has affected it, affected our work, because a lot of people ask us, oh, why don't you come dig south of Khartoum? Now Sudan has actually split into two countries, Sudan and South Sudan. And we could never work anywhere south of Khartoum because of the Civil War. It's not because we didn't want to, is we could not. And I just sort of fell in love with Sudan. It's very similar to Egypt, but at the same time, very different. And when I teach, I kind of tell them the relationship between Egypt and Sudan is kind of like the US and Canada. One's big, bold, and all these crazy monuments, and then you get the quiet little culture. In this case, it's south of Egypt or north of the US doing its thing. They look very similar on the surface, but when you actually start digging, in this case, quite literally, you notice how different they actually are.
Okay, and then we have a question for you, Lindsay, from Corey. She's curious to know who cleans and processes the fossils at the NC Natural Science Museum.
So we have people who are actually trained technicians. This is their expertise. They learn how to prepare the fossils and clean them and conserve them for the museum. So we have some staff who do that. But the bottleneck of all paleontological research is preparation. So I have already, in the decade that I've been here, amassed hundreds of fossils that are still in those plaster jackets that have yet to even be open. The typical mounted dinosaur you see in a museum could take hundreds of thousands of hours of preparation just to get clean before the research can happen. So because of that, most paleontology programs and museums have a large volunteer preparation program where we train volunteers who come in once or twice a week in how to prepare fossils, and they help us to process all this material so that we can actually get to doing the descriptions of the dinosaurs.
Great, thank you. And I have another question. This is actually from me. how big do the excavation crews and teams tend to be? Does it depend on the location usually? And it's for both of you.
For us, I think it depends. We tend to have a very small team of researchers, and then we hire local workmen. And we tend to have smaller teams because we don't want to expose large areas. That's how it used to be done like 100 years ago, because we really want to focus on what's actually coming out of the ground and documenting everything. The one time where, and usually that's like 30 workmen, that's not much. For 2 years at Dangale, we had a Discovery Channel crew with us. And they wanted more results faster kind of thing. So we had over 100 workmen working with us, and that's very demanding. And you need a lot of supervising eyes all over the place for that. We prefer smaller teams, but it also depends what you're doing. If you're doing surveying, you might want to have a bigger team to cover a broader area. So I think it really depends, but smaller teams mean you have better control of what's going on.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, for us, because of the nature of the work where we have to feed everyone and supply water for everyone in a remote area, it's really challenging to have teams that are more than 15 people. In fact, 15 people is sometimes really hard to manage. We were working at a site this summer where the temperature was, regularly between 110 and 120 every day, and people were going through 3 or 4 gallons of water each a day. So now you're talking about, you have 200 gallons of water, but that only lasts you 4 days with a team that size. So we usually use small teams, somewhere between 6 and 15 people, because logistically it's hard to manage a team that's that much bigger.
Okay, and then we got I think this is a really fun question from Sherry, asking if, or how accurate are the depictions of paleontologists and archaeologists on TV or in the movies?
Well, I don't get chased by dinosaurs on a regular basis. No one usually gets eaten. And I wish you could just brush off a whole skeleton with like a little paintbrush from the craft store, but that's not usually how it works. So I would say pretty inaccurate, generally speaking.
Yeah, I think the only similarities is the hat for us.
Yeah, it's true.
You have a hat, that's it, you're an archaeologist, but whatever you see Indiana Jones doing is basically looting, pilfering, which is the complete opposite of archaeology. But you do look cool in a hat, though.
You do need that hat, yeah.
Have there been any accurate depictions or semi-accurate depictions that you can think of?
I mean, the only one time that you see Indiana Jones excavating is that in the first movie, the Raiders of and he's on the mound and he's wearing his jalabia and he takes that off and the hat and he's pouncing around the web. That's the one, like 30 seconds of, that's what it would look like. Otherwise, no. You have to watch documentaries, I think, if you want to see the real deal.
And well, there's still a couple of questions, but I think for the sake of time, we'll just answer about 2 more. The one, let's see. So this is a question for both. Would an archaeologist and paleontologist collaborate on the discovery of a mummy?
Of a mummy? Unless that mummy was fossilized, probably not. Or we can go meet and have a drink and talk about it.
We can help you move it. We're really good at moving heavy stuff, but yeah, and I don't know if I mentioned this, but there is some bleeding when it comes to anthropology, right? Because paleontologists who study human evolution actually have their own name, paleoanthropologists. And actually, they're usually in their own academic departments. Sometimes they're even in their own colleges. So there's very little interaction between paleontologists who study people and paleontologists who study everything else. But even paleoanthropologists typically work on fossilized humans, human evolution. They don't work on mummies of more recent people.
Yeah.
Okay, and let's see, one last question. Okay. Okay, we received a lot of really great ones, so this is really tough. Okay, let's do this one from Marcel. If somebody finds a bone or a fossil and you know that it goes underneath a house or it's underneath a house, would you have to take down the house to get to the fossil, or is there another way to get to it?
And we're talking for archaeology or paleontology or?
They didn't specify.
Okay, because I'm thinking if there's a house, there are not a lot of people would live where you work, Lindsay. So I'm thinking perhaps it's more archaeology where you do find, just because sites have been occupied for thousands of years in places like Egypt, people might decide to dig a little, cellar in their basement or something, and poof, they're in a tomb. So it happens fairly frequently in Egypt, actually. And depending, I study temples. I'm an architecture, person, where you see blocks that belong to temples in someone's courtyard in Sudan. And then it's a whole lot of talking with those people, the owner of the house, and depending on the country where you're working, sometimes you have to get the antiquities involved. There's a whole bunch of, so a lot of people don't want to tell you that they have something in their house because they're afraid that something is going to happen to their house. And where we were, it was just like, no, I just want to see it. And, we don't want to do anything, but it's a lot of sort of relation building between the local communities and the archaeologists, because if we can, we will try not to displace anybody.
All right, well, I think that concludes our first annual virtual archaeology talk. Thank you all for being part of it, and we hope you can all join us again for the second annual next year. Stay tuned for more details. And thank you, Caroline and Lindsay, for this very fascinating talk and for sharing your insight and knowledge and expertise with us on what archaeologists and paleontologists really do. Hopefully you were able to clarify a lot of confusion. And we look forward to having you at our upcoming events and exhibitions, all of you attending right now. And thank you very much. Bye-bye.
You're very welcome. Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, we did get a comment, Caroline and Lindsay, that you girls need to do this more often.
I was thinking Caroline and I need to go have lunch. I have a girl crush on you and Archeo.
For a podcast, maybe starting a podcast. I would definitely tune into that.
I expect an invitation to work on a mummy, the next mummy you find.
Excellent. But maybe before that, we'll have to go ahead and do lunch.
All right.
Thank you, Maria.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.